Did Israel's God have a wife? Kinda. According to the Early History of God by Mark Smith, which this series is based on, this is part 4, the answer is kinda complicated. In the last couple of parts to this series, we've discussed the relationship between Yahweh, the God Israel eventually recognized as the one and only God, and the Canaanite deities El and Baal. All three were worshipped at some point in Israel's history, though their features were gradually absorbed into Yahweh. At first, El was a paternal god who lived on a mountain. In fact, Deuteronomy recognizes El as Yahweh's father. Eventually, it's discerned that Yahweh and El are just two names for the same God, as seen in God's dialogue with Moses in Exodus. Thus, Yahweh became the paternal God who lives on the mountain, and El's name was kept as a generic title used to describe Yahweh, the God who replaced him. Baal's fate was a little less friendly. While Baal was the original storm deity who rode chariots into battle and slaughtered Leviathan-like beasts, by the time of the Babylonian exile, Yahweh assumed all of those qualities, and the word Baal became a pejorative for false god, like it was a generic title for all false gods. Sounds like El got the better deal and Baal got the short end of the stick, or should I say, pole. This is an Asherah. It's a wooden pole symbolizing, well, the goddess Asherah. It is frequently mentioned casually in the Old Testament, and its usage was probably as early as the Judges period, though it lasted until shortly before the Babylonian invasion of Judah. In 2 Kings chapter 21 verse 7, King Manasseh built one of these, and a couple chapters later, King Josiah took it out of Jerusalem's temple. Why a wooden pole though? Seems like Asherah was represented by trees, and wooden poles symbolize trees. This is relevant because it looks like the Israelites had a love-hate relationship with certain types of trees. Before the monarchy, it was important to put altars next to trees, as described in Joshua chapter 24, verse 26 through 27. Later, an angel first appeared to Gideon, the judge, in a tree. But by the time we hit Isaiah, the condemnations of trees start flying. The aforementioned prophet condemns oaks, and Hosea chapter 4 verse 13 condemns a few kinds of trees. Deuteronomy chapter 16 verse 21 backtracks from the command in Joshua to build altars next to trees by forbidding planting any trees next to altars. To the uninformed reader, these condemnations might seem kind of random. Why would you condemn trees? But in the context that these trees represented a Canaanite goddess, it makes a lot more sense. As I mentioned before, the association of Asherah with trees gradually evolved into her association with poles, also called Asherahs. Thus, the prophetic condemnation of trees evolved into a condemnation of poles. In Judges chapter 6, 25 through 26, Gideon was commanded to cut down his father's Asherah, which was next to an altar of Baal. 2 Kings describes Asherahs as cultic objects of Samaria. Thus, we can see that there was clearly a shift in how Israelites perceived the symbols of Asherah. Well, who was she? Asherah was a maternal and nurturing goddess. She had healing powers, which we know because the Talmud, written centuries after all this happened, forbids using Asherah poles in medicine. Asherah was El's consort, though there's not much evidence that the Israelites believed she was Yahweh's wife. Like Baal did for false gods, it is believed that eventually her name became a catch-all term for false goddess. In fact, Judges chapter 3 verse 7 mentions that the Israelites worshipped the Baals and the Asherahs. There is debate about whether or not Asherah was worshipped by Israelites directly during the monarchy, but at the very least we can confidently say that the poles that symbolized her were kept at the very least as superstitious items. Now there is one more goddess that probably had some influence on Israelite culture, and that is Anat. Anat was the goddess of warfare, and while she isn't mentioned a whole lot in the Bible, there are some passages in Psalms and Deuteronomy that show how the Israelites, much like they did with Baal, took her qualities and attributed them to Yahweh. Here's some examples. Both Anat and Yahweh waged divine wars from their respective mountains. According to some particularly gory passages, Anat participated in a battle that produced heaps of corpses and skulls. In the aftermath of war, she fed on the flesh of her captives, drank the blood of her victims, and waded in the blood of the vanquished. Each of these gruesome activities carries its own parallels for Yahweh in Isaiah, Deuteronomy, and Psalms. You know, it's interesting. Some folks ask me why God seems so violent in the Old Testament. Where on earth did the Israelites get this bloody imagery from? Ladies and gentlemen, I present the Canaanite deities. As I've emphasized in previous parts to this series, if the Canaanites considered El the creator, then the Israelites said, no, Yahweh is the creator. If the Canaanites said Baal was a storm god, then Yahweh commanded the storms for Israelites. So if Anat was the goddess of war, for the Israelites, Yahweh was the superior god of war. I personally find the Old Testament much easier to stomach with this understanding that when the Israelites described their God, they would merely borrow descriptions that the Canaanites used for their gods, gruesome as they may have been. Speaking of gruesome, next week we will explore Israel's complicated relationship with a terrifying practice inherited from ancient Canaan: child sacrifice. Until then, have a great day. God bless you.